And so that's what I do. So tell me a little bit
Fantastic.
more about you.
I mean, like, the long story short, it's kind of funny actually, because I was writing, I'm currently writing an article just for our blog on, you know, what's happening in the EU now with the Green Deal in the EU. I don't know, I've been following all of that stuff, but it's now, you know, almost 20 years, I guess, 2002, that I was in South Africa for the World Summit on Sustainable Development there, which itself was Rio plus 10, right? So like, we've been talking about this on the United Nations level, yeah, for quite some time now. And you know, on the West Coast, the fact that we have a new season, which is basically just fire, and you know, heat domes and flooding in Europe and China and so on. And we knew it was coming. It's happening. Finally, the world seems to be waking up and starting to take action, but it's very slow.
It's slow and it's late. I was in Falmouth, Massachusetts almost 10 years ago, listening to 4 carbon cycle scientists from Woods Hole talking about it. Yeah. They were looking at all the graphs, predictive graphs. Yeah. And then the last line was what's actually happening, and said, it's 10 years ago. It's worse than any of the predicted.
Yeah. But I'm actually quite hopeful. So, you know, I'm mindful of that Winston Churchill quote, which is, you know, Americans can always be trusted to do the right thing after they've tried everything else. I always like that, because I think it's quite true.
I love it. Yeah.
Yeah. So you know, what's happening now is actually quite inspiring, and we're seeing big companies. We work with some of the dirtiest industries in the world, you know, mining, you know, manufacturing, maritime, and so on, simply because we fundamentally believe we can have the most impact there. Essentially, what we do is we help them rethink their supply chain and inventory. And so the big problem right now is, you know, if you look at the average life expectancy of, you know, one of these big bulk carriers, for instance, these big vessels transporting everything, they're a significant part of the world's carbon emissions. Yes. But changing, you know, the average lifespan of one of those vessels is 21 years. So reaching climate targets in the maritime industry in 10 years it isn't really realistic unless you retrofit existing equipment. Exactly. And from a cost perspective, that's really difficult to do, even though they go into dry dock and so on. They try to get the vessels out as quickly as possible, because downtime costs money. And so what we've sort of built now is we've got a digital ecosystem and a piece of software that looks at their procurement chain, looks at the parts that they're buying currently. And then we say, okay, well, first off, you're spending a lot of money, because that's the language they speak, yes, on carrying inventory and transporting goods around the world in terms of just your spare parts. We can actually digitize a lot of those parts, and that's a growing number of particularly plastic and metal parts. And once they're in the cloud, this sort of cloud inventory, we can then 3D print them or otherwise produce them locally on. And that's really what we do. So, you know, what's interesting from a sustainability point of view is the moment you switch to local manufacturing, you're drastically reducing the carbon footprint of those parts, because you're not doing the transport. But the other interesting thing is things like local recycling suddenly become more cost effective as well, because now the only thing you're importing is the raw materials. That's right. And so it's really, for me, one of the key elements to creating a circular economy and being able to do these sort of like, you know, retrofits that are necessary in the industries to be able to meet emission targets and go beyond that as well. And really what it comes down to is switching from having 10,000 parts gathering dust in a warehouse somewhere to being able to produce parts on demand locally in a much more sustainable way. And you know, there are lots of different aspects to that, but actually a big part of it as well is when you don't have 10,000 parts in inventory, you can make much more rapid design and engineering changes, meaning that from an energy efficiency point of view, we can not just create smart part, but what I'm calling wise parts, you know, parts that learn from replacement to replacement and get better and more energy efficient and better for the world and better for the local community and so on. So it's kind of a very new, fresh space, and we're really just scratching the surface right now. But that's really what we're about. And you know, I love supply chain. I've been geeking out on it for a while now. And we think that maintenance repair operations, be it agriculture, or hospital infrastructure, or, you know, really any kind of situation where you have equipment that you're using over an extended period of time. It needs to evolve, and we think we're part of the solution, which is we need to go away from planned obsolescence and into much more of a, you know, planned maintenance and evolution. You know, one of the things that we've been playing with right now, which might be interesting to you as well, is we're currently looking at a project in South Africa for one of the larger mining companies, and their, you know, interests are typically commercial, as big companies are. What it is they have local targets for job creation that they have to meet in order to renew contracts and so on, and also emission reduction targets and the other stuff. So we've done inventory analysis and actually identified out of what they're using right now, spare parts, you know, significant value can actually be shifted to the local community in terms of on-demand production. And one of the things that we're now talking about there, which could be interesting for you guys as well, is to look at it in terms of a regional or city, you know, perspective, and say, okay, given all the businesses, small, medium, large, and what they use in terms of spare parts and building infrastructure and so on, we have software that can just go through previous procurement data. So essentially, everyone just gives us an Excel data dump of, like, you know, what they bought, which is fairly minimal data, but we have some smart stuff in the back end that can look at that. And then our software can essentially estimate how much of that can be produced locally, and what the local value add could be, and whether it makes sense now or in the future as we add, you know, there's new technologies and new production tools coming out all the time. You know, so what we're essentially looking at is we're looking at the data sets and then being able to say, okay, well, you know, does it make sense to produce things locally, and if so, how much, and using what tools? And then as new technologies come along, you know, that picture gets upgraded together with new supply needs and so on. But that's the sort of thing that I've really been wanting to do, because part of it, from a resiliency and particularly disaster response point of view, as we've very well experienced with COVID, is in situations where you have mass catastrophe, supply chain shortages happen. And, you know, we've got cases in 3D printing where, for instance, local hospitals couldn't get the parts they needed for, you know, oxygen splitters and other things like that. And if you haven't done the work beforehand to actually create a, you know, digital library of the parts that are necessary, then your response is going to be much slower as well.
I'm thinking of so many people to connect you with that I'm wondering if it might be interesting just to set up a Zoom where we have a number of people who could be interested in what you're doing, including the chairman of my board, Stuart Valentine of Centerpoint Investing. We would be a very interesting test bed for looking at supply chains throughout a small community. So this would be a place where your kind of innovation would be welcomed, and thinking about the harder aspects of turning a city into a resilient city, being able to do this analysis of what's needed in the city and what can actually be manufactured locally. Wow.
Yeah, and it fits very well with our thesis, right? We fundamentally believe that decentralized manufacturing and digital distribution with local on-demand production is a key to creating a sustainable economy, right? and a sustainable future. And I think what we've done successfully in the past is, particularly when we're working with groups of companies, or sort of, you know, regional or local clusters, is we do these joint innovation projects where essentially, you know, anyone who's interested can come in and we'll, you know, work together to essentially map out what the need may be. That can be done fairly quickly. It's not a huge commitment on our part or anyone else's part. And then based off that, you know, a development plan can be made and implemented. And you know, just to be clear, we don't just do 3D printing. A big part of what we look at is on-demand manufacturing. So our background is from the additive manufacturing or 3D printing space, just because that's what I've been geeking out on the last 10 years together with the team. But what we realized is when you're doing local production, there are local plasma cutters and plastic manufacturers and all of these, essentially established actors in the community that have the tools. But what they haven't had the tooling for necessarily in the past is to look for all of those cases across the community where spare parts are actually coming in.
Well, you'll love this. A local philanthropist who just dropped a pile of money into a beautiful little park in memory of his late wife, now bought the old armory building and is turning it into, he said, it will be one, if not the best, it'll be one of the best sound stages in the country.
Lovely.
And so Frank at Deep Green Machine is manufacturing parts for Paul Squillo at Golden Ears Audio to create this world-class sound system in this old armory building. It is absolutely already happening.
Fantastic. But why don't you, so if you want to just share, and if you're interested in setting up a Zoom chat or whatever, I'm happy to provide a quick presentation on kind of how we could see this happen.
Give me some times that would be good for you within a week or two. Yeah. And because we're moving very quickly. So one final thought, by analogy, the analogy of what you were talking about, making local manufacturing being dramatically more efficient. We're working on a program. We're actually responding to a community development block grant, COVID relief money. We're looking at building a scaled up home garden program here, because a local professor who was the head of the SL department, sustainable living department of the university, has written a book. He's done 2 years of research to show that home gardening is vastly more efficient than the industrial food system, and has demonstrated that he can feed himself for a year on 1% of the land that is generally allocated to feed a US citizen. Now, granted, that's pretty wasteful. It's a pretty low bar. So what strikes me is the profound analogy. Same with more localized farming. It's incredibly inefficient to grow stuff in California that's drying out anyway and ship it across the country. Grow it here, grow it in your backyard. That's the most efficient. Then the next tier of efficiency is local agriculture. There's just all kinds of fascinating connections and doing advanced manufacturing and tech to make that local agriculture just as efficient as it can possibly be.
Fantastic.
And as carbon sequestering as it can possibly be.
Right.
So anyway.
Yeah, I'm a strong agree. My wife would agree as well. She's very much into local gardening. So
this is absolutely fantastic. Thank you for spending time. Give me some blocks of time. I'll choose one, and we'll just collect. We'll collect who collects, and we'll have a conversation.
Sounds great, Bob. Thank you so much for reaching out. I really appreciate that. And,
Take care.
Have a great day.